The first one we are going to make is is the idea revisiting dignity in the context of displacement. We are going to present evidence from Rohingyas, the actual pronunciation in locally Rohingyas. In English we say Rohingyas. So Rohingyas in Bangladesh and internally displaced persons, IDPs in Afghanistan. I have co-authored this with my colleagues Muhammad Yasin Ayobi and Muhammad Ehsan Al Khabir. I acknowledge their participation, but unfortunately they cannot participate here. And I should also mention the research was funded by the British Academy. So the objective of this presentation is to explain how displaced people perceive dignity. I will explain later why this is important. The second objective is how perceptions of displaced Rohingyas from Myanmar who are now living in Bangladesh and internally displaced persons, IDPs in Afghanistan, are compatible with how dignity is conceptualized in existing social science literature. You have noticed that I have said that the Rohingyas from Myanmar now living in Bangladesh. So Rohingyas now are living in in multiple countries. So we are focusing on those people who are now living in Bangladesh. It does not represent the Rohingya views who are living in many different countries. Our final objective is we'll try to understand the possible policy implications for dignified resolutions. Dignified, which is yet effective and durable for the Rohingyas and the IDPs. A little bit of background. The two groups we are talking about today, the Rohingyas in Bangladesh and the IDPs in Afghanistan, they represent two of the largest groups of displaced people in the current world. Roughly around 1 million Rohingyas are now living in Bangladeshi camps. It can be contested. The official statistics in the UNHCR say slightly lower. However, the government of Bangladesh claims the number is much higher according to their statistics. And it also includes Rohingyas who came prior to 2017 as well. So Rohingyas were oppressed for a long time, took refuge in Bangladesh, probably in other countries too, but they were coming to Bangladesh prior to 2017. But 2017 was a massive, massive influx of their incoming, and the number just shot up, and it stood according to Bangladeshi media and Bangladeshi government, 1.1 million. And UNHCR talks a little less, slightly around 800,000 or 900,000 people. The IDP is similar. The number is contested, but at least 3 million people seem to be internally displaced due to violence, and roughly around 1 million people are being internally displaced in Afghanistan due to natural disasters, flooding, droughts, and other causes. So we'll focus on people who are in Bangladesh from the Rohingya community, and also the IDPs in Afghanistan who are internally displaced for conflict reasons. The reason, like I was saying, I'll explore why dignity of displaced people are important, because dignity of displaced people are hardly visible in existing literature. Not only they're hardly visible in existing literature, they're also they do not make to the the humanitarian actions or humanitarian programs. They do not they're the passive recipient of aid. They seem to be not that a group of people who have their agency or aware of their dignity either. And consequently, they do not make to the any policy discussions. Everybody else are in the policy roundtables except the Rohingyas in most of the cases. I'm not going to say every cases. What we have observed that displaced people are frequently labeled as burden, particularly by the host countries. Below, you'll see that I have taken a quote from the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. I must acknowledge that Bangladesh and the Prime Minister, but the political party, the government of Bangladesh, have received wider praise from the global community and international community for their support for giving refuge to this to this vulnerable and victimized group. But this enthusiasm is now after 2 years, over 2 years, is going down a bit in a sense, understandably maybe, that the government is feeling that it is too difficult to manage these people. They have many other needs. There is financial pressure. There is internal political pressure. There are other different pressures. So the prime minister as well as other ministers are trying to say, and even many local scholars, they're trying to say, look, these are not our people. Why should we do why should we carry on with these people? So they're often labeled as a burden. And I quote there that Rohingyas have caused a huge burden for Bangladesh, and international community should take some responsibilities too. This was quoted from the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. I do not think this is a isolated incident. I was in Turkey in March, just before the COVID-19, in Turkey for a Royal Academy Conference, Royal Academy of Engineering. There I also met people from Turkey who are working with Syrian refugees, and I could sense, and people are telling me they also feel these people are burden to them. They have had enough of these refugees. Perhaps you can also see the geopolitics when Mr. Erdogan also tries to threaten European community and international community that they should be taking responsibilities of these people. Otherwise, he will leave the border open so that they can go to Europe. Right. So this is something we are trying to look at. These people are hardly visible. Their voices are hardly ever heard. They are being treated as a burden rather than more human victimized group. What do we mean by dignity? Why dignity is important, and why dignity is important to understand from these victimized groups' perspective. Dignity, while I use the word nebulous, I'm sure I hope that ex-Prime Minister Theresa May will not come and say it's a concept, she was not very clear about Brexit. So nebulous, I say this because it's not very clear what people exactly mean about dignity. It's a concept that is being taken for granted as if we understand what dignity means, right? And I explain in academic scholarship, dignity is often conceptualized by the theorists who assume or perceive dignity through different hypotheses or through their activities and writing of the theory building. Hardly the lived experiences of the people, let alone the victimized groups or the poor or the marginalized people, generally hardly lived experiences of general people in explaining how or what they perceive as dignity is invisible there. This is not only represent a top-down approach. We argue that it also deny and exclude the voices of those very people whose dignity are at stake or affected. In major international treaties, I'll explain a little later as well, the idea can best be described as a nebulous one, while some, such as Bagarich, I hope I pronounced the name right, and Alan argues that they have even called dignity as a Bakawas concept, right? I'm not going to go more into detail. People tend to cite this particular reference very frequently without looking into the details. But these authors claimed, because an American report did not include the experts who can talk about dignity, while they included in one of their reports where charity leaders and politicians were present, and that's why they said the idea was nebulous, not clear at all. So dignity has some it seems to be as if something innately clear, which is not, but it has never been it never includes the lived experience of the poor people. As I was talking the international treaty, I read very quickly the introduction of the founding charter of the UN reads that we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. While I read that out, I do not know if you understood what they mean dignity by this. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights also proclaimed that recognition of inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. You see, these are two examples. There are a few other examples we could have cited. They talk about dignity as a cornerstone of human rights and social justice, but never mention what exactly dignity means. A recent study from Overseas Development Institute, they also say modern humanitarian aid programs seldom gather or report affected communities' views on dignity. That's where that's what gives us the platform to explore more. So as I said, we'll be comparing how dignity is portrayed in the literature as well as in the views from the affected people, namely Rohingyas and IDPs. I very quickly give you some ideas just to cover up the theoretical aspect. Immanuel Kant is being labeled or is being credited as one of the leading theorists in dignity. He asserts that humanity itself is a dignity. For a man cannot be used merely as a means by any man, but must be used at the same time as an end. His argument looks into that all humans are worthy of respect, and as a rational being, possesses an unconditional and incomparable worth that Kant describes as human dignity. However, Schroeder and Bonisadar, they argue that when dignity is deemed to be inalienable and inviolable, why would something that is inviolable, meaning secure from attack, assault, or trespass, need protection? Because we understand that sometimes for some group of people, dignity needs to be protected. Not in the case of only the Rohingyas and the IDPs. There are many people like us. There are many people in the society whose dignity needs to be protected, who can be ostracized, victimized, marginalized in many other ways. For Hill, relating to from the Kantian perspective, to treat people with Kantian dignity is to treat them as autonomous individuals able to choose their destiny. And we'll relate this whether this victimized group we are talking, can they do this? However, in short, to say that this discussion on dignity in this sense can be extended to social status, self-worth, and honor. So to sum up very quickly, that dignity can be for Kolani means worth or worthiness. Worth is inherent in each human because this cannot be conferred or taken away, right? So that's what constitutes dignity. So the notion of self-worth closely linked with respect or self-respect. And here respect refers to how individuals treat each other and like to be treated in everyday interactions, while self-respect denotes sense of self-worth and personal space, right? However, other colleagues, Harman and Getz, assert that respect and honor are used interchangeably. While Harman thinks dignity and honor are inseparable, Leung and Cohen argue that honor is different from dignity, as you could see at the top, that sometimes dignity is inherent, respect is inherent, you cannot take away. Yeah, worth cannot be taken away. So dignity or respect may not be, honor can be taken away. It's not the inherent thing like other people believe in terms of dignity. Moving on to this, for this particular presentation, we say that there is a proper connection with religious texts as well. Yeah, not very highly though, not very frequently, but human dignity is also looked into religious lens, looked through religious lens. The human being, for example, is an avatar of a deity in Hinduism. In Judaism, is created in God's image and is moral agents in Confucianism, and even coexist with the divine through hypostatic union in Jesus Christ. For the case of this group of people who are mainly Muslim, IDPs and the Rohingyas, in Islam, we say in human dignity increases by honoring each individual, and doing so elevates one's own dignity. There is a strong similarity between dignity in Quran, the holy text of the Muslim people, and dignity as virtue. And in particular, a strong emphasis on developing self-worth and assisting others in doing so. In humiliating others, one loses one's own dignity because humans become and remain noble through virtuous acts, and virtue is realized both in the expansion of freedom through development. So why dignity matters in this case? So we have established now from philosophical perspective to religious perspective. It matters because it bases the social basis of self-respect and non-humiliation are being able to be treated as a dignified being whose worth is equal to that of others. This entails provisions of non-discrimination on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, ethnicity, caste, religion, and national origin. The language of dignity is particularly connected with human rights and are full of emancipatory language of human dignity. This is notable that dignity was not dignity did not make to the mainstream literature for a long time, up until even last century. Only after the Second World War, we will see their dignity appears in many different national constitution and international treaties, like I have explained before briefly. So understanding dignity as a right, so it has taken a right approach, invites us to reflect on the formulation of a politics of everyday life. Because human dignity encapsulates all forms of human rights, including civil, political, social, economic, and physical integrity, and cultural rights, among many others. So what we want to achieve by explaining this, that dignity as human right, when you recognize this, actors from both the global north and south are able to celebrate the differences of various identities and shift the conversation toward actual policies and governance structures to support and promote justice. So when this is the case, as we said, we try to explore this because none of those were coming from or included the views of the affected people themselves. So we did our field work in Afghanistan as well as in Bangladesh, and data collected in Bangladesh from July to December in the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar. We collected data from Afghanistan remotely over the phone, and because of security reasons. So we have collected this data in between May and October from 8 provinces in Afghanistan, namely Kabul, Nangarhar, Pakaya, Mazar, Kunduz, Herat, Kandahar, and Badakhshan. For this paper, the evidence we'll be includes 308 interviews, 40 in-depth interviews with Rohingyas, and 270 interviews with IDPs. I must note that IDPs interviews were shorter because of the mode we took through telephone. It was not as deep as what we could do for the Rohingya interviews. So we interpret and transcribe this data in English, coded everything in Vivo, find the suitable themes, what dignity means to them, and here we present those in the next slides. So firstly, how Rohingyas in Bangladeshi camps receive dignity. So they identified few aspects, 6 aspects, we'll say one by one. Safety is first of them. So here on the left hand side, you'll see a picture from a mother who was showing a picture of her son who is still in Myanmar's prison. She obtained this picture by bribing the prisoners in Myanmar through some mobile money from Bangladeshi camps. So they were explaining to us that the situation was very dire. They were saying even when foxes were barking at night, they were so scared because safety was a persistent problem for their dignity. They were thinking even they were chatting together, the Rohingya militaries and Myanmar militaries were shooting at them, and they were asking what do you think? How could you have any dignity in such circumstances? So the physical safety also took a different dimension in the fear of being raped or harassed or something. So younger women's, they used to mask their faces by smearing them with charcoal so that they could look ugly, so that military will not take them because they will be treated as filthy. For many of them, moving on from safety reason, identity is another issue. Rohingyas were not treated as as a citizen of Myanmar. They were always treated as foreigners coming, or foreigners coming from different countries, mainly from Bangladesh. So the people, they were saying that without a national identity, without being accepted as one of them, how could one have dignity? So identity was one of the key indicator for dignity. As you can see from this, from the below quotes, they were saying that Arakan is our birthplace. Being recognized as Rohingya means getting accepted, getting access to all of our rights. Dignity means being able to live in your own homeland as a citizen. You cannot have dignity when people do not treat you like their citizens. As I said before, that religion played instrumental role for both these groups, and we have found from Rohingyas' perspective that they identify somebody dignified. Those who pray 5 times a day are respected mostly in their society, or for female who maintain hijab are respected within their community. They also value knowledge, education, and wisdom, which they call ilm. Ilm is like probably an Arabic word or like slight transformation of an Arabic word into their language. So who have possessed some ilm, they call ilimda. So you see, they say ilimdaras are very respected, and if one is educated, they also respect him too. And somebody was saying, if I have ilm and connection with the Myanmar government, the society would respect. So you see the societal respect there too in terms of dignity. Wealth and self-reliance, especially now that the Rohingyas are not allowed to work in Bangladeshi camps, seem to be a key indicator for them too. They were saying you can work with pride and dignity if you have education and wealth. And in terms of Myanmar context, when they were living in Myanmar, how they had their dignity was affected and lost, they were saying, look, I have lost everything. My fishing boat, my shop, everything was burned down. And we have to abandon all those things. And now that I'm here without any income, any source, how can I have the dignity? Finally, the sixth aspect of their understanding was solidarity and mutual respect. Respect comes from how they exhibit themselves between each other. And they try to pass it into generational learning so that others learn from them how to treat other people. As they say, good deeds such as helping people in trouble, offering rice to someone who needs it, and making others happy retrieve our dignity. So moving on from these 6 themes, we'll talk about how IDPs in Afghanistan perceive dignity. Like Rohingyas, compassion and respect also try to also feature in the IDPs perception. They say we try our best to respect someone who respects us, and respecting females in particular is their right, and that's their dignity. And how this was affected even by their own neighbors as migrants, their neighbors in the new settlement, when they were collecting drinking water, they are being treated as foreigners, somebody who have who have invaded somebody else's place. So people prevented them from taking water and said something which was offensive for them, and that's how they felt their dignity is being lost. The protection from violence and sexual abuse is also true because in the camps and by the humanitarian actors or by many people in the new host community, there were risks of sexual violence, sexual abuse, and other forms of violence. As you can see, people said that dignity for me simply means not being raped and even not to be at risk of it, right? And in terms of humanitarian actors receiving aid because their life depended on humanitarian aid, they were talking we heard about it, that some organizations forced women into sexual abuse. In the same way, I think assembling men and women in one place to receive aid is against our dignity because that was against their religious freedom. And we'll explain this a little bit more afterwards in this slide. They also identified that it is about basic needs, having something, having a shelter, having something to eat, having something to wear that forms their dignity, because the new condition leaves them in a dire situation where they cannot have any dignity. In terms of religion and cultural values, they also say that it is important to maintain their dignity by following religious rules. In one quotation at the bottom of left hand side box, someone was saying that in my opinion, dignity means that our women and men protect themselves from bad deeds and abide by Islamic regulations. The difference from Rohingyas to IDPs, peace and security came very heavily. They were saying look, if there is no peace, our situation will be like this and continue to be like this. So without peace, we'll not have any dignity. And someone was also talking, with peace, even we could live with a loaf of a bread on a mountain. I think it's an Afghan phrase, and we took it like that. So what we try to conclude here, we feel that our empirical evidence presented here offer new insights through a bottom-up approach to the dignity scholarship. While traditional approaches, like I was talking in the existing social science literature, they ignore the importance, experience, and perception of dignity from the victim group's perspective and deny their voice, it is evident that despite being very vulnerable, and therefore almost invisible in policy discourses, displaced people are well capable of articulating what dignity means to them. While we have adopted a bottom-up approach, we do not think it is possible to offer a general framework. We are not saying that this is the general framework applicable for all refugees. Dignity is multidimensional, dignity is contextual. In other contexts, and for other community, the notion of dignity might have some overlaps, some crossovers, but there might be some differences too. So to the final point, we contend that views of the displaced people need to be incorporated in assorted policy negotiations and formulations by national, regional, and international policymakers, including states, politicians, civil society, and humanitarian organizations. It is important that policies are formulated with greater humility, recognizing the vulnerable target population's ability to generate nuanced and deeper understanding of the problem and suitable policy solutions for those. To some extent, it is consistent with Chambers' argument of putting the last first. So we conclude by saying that in the objective, we said that we intend to contribute to the academic policy scholarship. We hope that our findings of our study help the policymakers become more conscious about the dignity of displaced people as they perceive it. And finally, we believe our empirical evidence has direct policy relevance to the Rohingyas in Bangladesh and IDPs in Afghanistan. We also think our arguments may have significant relevance for other displaced people all over the world. And there I would like to stop, and thanks very much. We'll welcome your questions and comments. I could open up the podium now if you have any urgent question to ask. I'll take one question now, and then we'll move on to another next presentation, please. If you have any question, please just join in the podium and ask. Hello, Barbara.
Hi. I just wanted to find out, it's a very nice presentation. It's also in line with what I'm doing, but I'm mainly looking at environmentally displaced people. So I wanted to find out that in terms of dignity, did you see that there are some people who went back because they felt that their dignity was not honored, or all of them who were displaced and they were taken to go to this place, they stayed there despite that their dignity was not honored?
Yes, it is violated in most cases. When somebody lose their habitat, their own home, you see living home is a intensely personal reasons, and people do not want to do that. So when people are violated from from different rights, this can also happen through different forms. And in these cases, for the cases we have taken, these were not honored, and these were violated in their own places, original places, and then afterwards these were not honored for many different reasons through the services of aid, management of aid, and how they are being placed in different camps. If you look at some of the pictures, these are congested. It is not possible to protect their views and values about the religious, cultural, social aspect, how they feel dignity. In that case, it was violated in this way. I hope that answers your question. As promised, I will go off now, and our next presentation is from colleagues from University of Oxford, and what we'll do, we'll upload their slides and start a presentation which is being recorded. So now I'm going to broadcast the audio recorded presentation, and I'll be off.
Hi everyone, my name is Evan Easton Calabria and I'm coming to you from Oxford, UK. I'm a Senior Research Officer at the Refugee Studies Centre, University of Oxford, and today I and my colleagues who are based in Addis in Ethiopia are going to be talking about some of our research and some of the case study work we've done in Adama, Ethiopia, a city about an hour and a half from Addis, with IDPs over the last several months. So in our focus on dignified resolutions, we're going to highlight three main aspects of the IDP response that this city, Adama, undertook. So first, there was a coordinated response between regional and local governments that included a lottery system. And second, really the involvement of different sectors of society in a way that was, we argue, really focused on kind of demonstrating the needs and the dignity of the IDPs that had arrived. And third, my colleague Delina will talk about Indigenous associations that were led and really created by IDPs themselves to support each other. So in our research, we found on one hand an immediate, very humanizing collective response to the arrival of IDPs in Adama, and on the other hand, a gap in the development phase of support, which demonstrates the needs, the ongoing kind of issues, and I think some of the struggles of kind of long-term engagement with people in humanizing, dignified ways. So our work definitely captures both the, I'd say, the good practices and some of the gaps that are worthy of being further explored. And briefly, so in 2018, which is when the IDPs that we have undertaken research with were displaced, more people were displaced as a result of conflict than ever before. And obviously, we know that number has really steadily gone up. But the number of IDPs across the world escalated from 28 million to an estimated 41.3 million. And in Ethiopia itself in 2018, there was a huge increase in its IDP population. A total of over 3 million people were internally displaced following violence and conflicts between ethnic Somalis and Oromos. So if you have our PowerPoint open, you're welcome to switch to the next slide, which just shows a map of Ethiopia. And Adama is just a bit below Addis, which is fairly central in the map. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Delina right now to briefly go over our methods, and then we'll get to the main substance of our presentation.
Thanks, Dr. Evan, for the introduction. Just to give a little overview of the study, we took a qualitative case study approach to understand the municipal response to IDPs in Adama. Our colleague Zahang and myself traveled to Adama, which is about 45 minutes away from the capital, Addis Ababa, twice a week to conduct 3 to 4 interviews per day for about 4 to 5 months, and each interview was about 45 minutes to an hour long. Our research followed a snowballing sampling methodology, and we conducted about 70 interviews with different key stakeholders. These include the city administration, the mayor's office, relevant government bureaus, local administrative directors, the private sector actors, international and local NGOs, local communities, community associations, and we've also had a chance to interview IDPs and collect primary data.
So immediately after IDPs were displaced, most of them went to camps in the Oromia region, and they received humanitarian assistance, often international humanitarian assistance. And in general, most of our informants stayed in the camps for about 8 months. But there was subsequently a regional lottery system that was created within Oromia in order to settle many of these IDPs. So it was very voluntary that IDPs signed up, and they knew that they and their households, so it was by households, would be reassigned to one of 11 cities in the Oromia region that had been selected based on discussions with the mayors and based on the capacity of these cities to host IDPs. In order to determine which city they were resettled in, IDP households drew a ticket in the form of kind of a registration code that they'd been assigned. The lottery was anonymous, it was random, and it was created like this very purposefully in order to be seen as transparent, to not, take people's particular interests or other situations into account, which I guess on one hand could be seen as something negative, but was actually really embraced by the IDPs that we spoke with, who felt like it was a fair system that offered them a way out of the camps. And so that in and of itself, as a voluntary way to help people get into longer term, kind of more sustainable situations, offers a good practice. That for someone like me who has a background in refugee assistance, that it's quite a unique situation to learn about. One thing that we definitely did hear, though, is that people who went to Adama were actually, quite happy in part because they went to Adama. So it's a city that, depending on traffic, is between 45 minutes and an hour and a half from Addis, so quite close compared to other cities. And in contrast to other cities that received IDPs, there was actually a very collective response. So starting at the regional level, even I guess from the national level, in terms of the government really wanting people to know that IDPs were arriving, that IDPs needed help. And people really responded from all sectors of society. So we saw what we're calling a kind of a cascading communication approach. So there was one message that was shared widely once IDPs arrived in Adama that was focused on helping them get support. There was very strong media coverage. There was this kind of a social appeal circled on social media, through the radio, through television. These seem to be crucial factors in raising awareness of the need to help. And it was really a call for solidarity. So on one hand, we saw some representations of IDPs as victims, but far more prevalent was really a kind of presentation of IDPs as brothers and sisters. One of the coordinators at the mayor's office who was part of this campaign said, quote, "It was very painful to witness a person being forcefully displaced from where he or she used to live just because he or she is Oromo. Adama city residents also felt the pain. We therefore sent out a call for action with a motto, people for people, wegen la wegen. Everyone, from big to small, had placed their fingerprint in response to the call." So with our informants, which ranged from the private sector, as Delina mentioned, to individual citizens, to local government, we really were able to identify a sort of positive obligation that, like I said, was based on kind of solidarity of people being seen as part of a bigger collective. And there was also a really interesting way of gathering support. So private sector actors were asked to donate money, but individuals were actually asked to donate time. So people who came to these neighborhoods, these kebeles where IDPs initially settled, and were cooking for IDPs, and offering not only food but also their time to cook and so on. And we know that at least $1 million was raised within the span of just a few months, and this was actually without international assistance. And much of this money went towards housing. So within the span of a very short amount of time overall, local community associations, private sector actors, individuals contributed to construct houses for IDPs in 4 settlements. And every registered IDP household received a private resettlement house, along with documents confirming their tenancy, which actually enabled many of them later to get microfinance loans because they had proof of collateral. And these resettlement houses were distributed using a similar lottery system, so with the aim of being fair and equal to IDPs. So for those that have the PowerPoint open, the next slide shows just a picture from the distance of the resettlement houses. And right near the settlements was actually a school that was constructed, which is the next slide, the Sina Siba School, that was built specifically for IDPs and for primary school students who was kind of seen couldn't walk as far or take a transport into the city as easily as others. So what we saw overall was a very quick, as I said, humanizing response to the IDP's arrival, wherein very quickly people who otherwise literally would have been homeless were given houses that had been constructed based on money donated. There was a school constructed. There were efforts to integrate students into existing schools. So a very powerful start to a resettlement process. And most IDPs have been here now for about 2 years, so it was interesting to hear about the beginning of their process and then what's happening later on. And there are definite gaps. It seems that there are some efforts to help integrate these IDPs into the economy, but for various reasons, including some cultural gaps that one might not expect, that's been difficult. Obviously, there's a high unemployment rate anyway in many parts of Ethiopia, including in Adama, which doesn't help. And there are efforts to offer microfinance loans and so on, but it's limited because although IDPs were given houses, these houses, as in many cases with displaced people, are quite far from the city. So that precludes kind of easy opportunities for business. And that's something that I think is a real takeaway in terms of kind of settlement with dignity, that where are we putting people and what does that mean for them, not just, having a roof over their heads, but for the rest of their lives, potentially. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Delina again, who's going to talk more about some of the work that IDPs themselves have done to support each other within these settlements.
Understanding the importance of traditional groups in terms of promoting social support, self-reliance, and integration, IDPs in Adama took the initiative to start and be a part of Iddir and Uquba Association. As a brief definition, Iddir in Ethiopia is a voluntary association established among neighbors primarily to provide mutual aid in relation to burial matters and support members during wedding ceremonies. But more recently, Iddir associations are also providing microcredit and finance association to members. On the other hand, Uquba is a traditional informal savings and credit associations where individuals come together to save periodically and take turns to disperse the saved amount to its members. These two associations have helped IDPs support each other and address key challenges within their communities. Specifically, one of the women-led Iddir has 50 members, and they met regularly on Sundays at 2 p.m., where they take turns to host the meeting and discuss about different issues and share their stories. This was, of course, before the COVID-19 situation. They also contributed a monthly fee for the Iddir, which is deposited in the bank and used for different purposes, such as burial matters, wedding ceremonies, and during emergencies to help members. During each meeting, they also practice uqub and collect money to save regularly. The collected money is given to the hostess for that meeting, and eventually every member will get a chance to host a meeting. Uqub is uniquely beneficial for IDPs as it is interest-free. It is religiously appropriate since most of the IDPs are Muslim, and they don't have to pay additional interest fees. As a result, Iddir and Uqub associations have helped IDPs in terms of social support, self-reliance, and as well as integration. During our meeting with the founder of Women Iddir, she stated, and I quote, "We lived a separate life when we first got here. We didn't understand the problem our neighbors were facing. Nobody knew which woman was facing domestic violence. Nobody knew nothing. Nobody even cared when there was a conflict between neighbors. Nobody knew each other, so nobody cared about each other. We didn't know each other before the Iddir, but now we do. It's a nice space to share your thoughts and discuss different things." Quote. And she continued and said, quote, "In fact, the social support is more beneficial than the money." Quote. Therefore, utilizing these pre-existing traditional groups to promote social support, self-reliance, and integration can be absolutely effective, and policymakers and assistance agencies should consider ways to help and collaborate with these groups.
Building on what Delina said, I'll just discuss a few other options that we think are really important takeaways from this case study and kind of thinking about really what assistance approaches look like that have human dignity at the center. And I'd say that from the case study of Adama and obviously the wider regional response, finding ways to get people out of camps that are, dignified, that do offer them a way to become settled elsewhere, to be offered support is extremely important. Like I referenced, the lottery system that led over 1,000 households to end up in Adama was voluntary, and it was also anonymous and random ultimately. And so while we see the merits of this, it's also interesting to consider kind of going forward, are there ways to create lottery systems that might actually take people's preferences into account, knowing that people probably have family in other parts of the country, that there are particular reasons why people might choose voluntarily elsewhere to go other than where they are assigned. That's something we're definitely seeing in Adama as well, that there's a lot of undocumented migrants that are forced migrants from the same conflict areas, but weren't part of this formal registration and resettlement effort. And because of that, they're not eligible for housing. They're not eligible for food. They're not eligible for microfinance loans and so on. So we see a huge disparity in treatment actually based on the method through which people arrived. So while those people that were registered did come and receive a house and more. Many did not, and we actually don't know the number. So another takeaway that we haven't touched on yet is actually just documenting who arrives in places. And obviously there's dignity in remaining undocumented, that a lot of the people that I work with in Ethiopia and elsewhere have actually chosen to enter cities without being registered for reasons of safety and security. So that's something that should be respected as well, but also understanding that there are people that may receive recourse to assistance if there are official mechanisms, and beyond the initial effort to resettle people in Adama and in these cities, we're not aware of formal efforts. And that seems crucial in terms of helping people access, the assistance they need, and also from the perspective of a city as well, of, what are the resources that are being used, what's the infrastructure that's being used, and how maybe could there be more support for that given population influxes. And secondly, just going back to this communication approach that we've seen, initially there was a really powerful call for support that was very well responded to. And there's just an ongoing need for helping highlight the situation of IDPs, of forced migrants, and in ways that are humanizing, in ways that are portraying them, as they would like to be portrayed, and beyond this, the kind of perspective and the gaze as victims. So we find that actually this could have a huge effect on social integration, which is still lacking even after several years, that if there were more ways to involve the culture of these IDPs in drama or music or news segments, that might be a way to promote intercultural learning and all of that which we hope would come naturally through people living in the same place. And lastly, just as Delina did such an eloquent job of describing, the need to just build on what forced migrants and here IDPs are doing for themselves, that there's incredible work being done at the micro level that is not micro work at all. So we see social support, we see financial support, we see community organizing happening, and far too often these are happening under the radar without assistance, without awareness, or even without kind of the interest in these efforts being built on by other humanitarian actors, such as local governments or international humanitarian agencies and so on. And when we think of dignity, just the first thing that comes to my mind is thinking about the ways that people know to help themselves and the ways people are responding to their own situations, and that being really at the core of an assistance approach that is focused on dignity. So I'll conclude with two quotes, and one is from UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who called for a fundamental shift in our approach to internal displacement, one that goes from meeting immediate humanitarian needs to one that preserves the dignity and improves the lives and self-reliance of displaced persons. And I think in Adama we see some really promising examples of that being addressed, and also a wider recognition of the challenges of people arriving and people becoming integrated. And lastly, this is a quote just from one of our IDP informants who said, "We went through so much, we just want to settle here. We want to work here and change our lives. We just want to live like others." And that as well should be at the center of a dignified assistance approach, of understanding what people want, the situations they left, and where they want to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evan and colleagues. What I will do now, I will bring Delina Abadi onto the stage and open one of the podiums. If you have any question, you could ask, and I'm sure Delina will be able to answer your questions. Delina.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I apologize that my colleagues couldn't be here today. Gez Zahing was actually online earlier, but I guess he got disconnected. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to bring them up.
While others are we could talk how we compare in our studies, how we felt and perceived dignity or found dignity. So while you looked into these people, what do you, as Evan was talking at the end, that the idea that they want to leave just like everybody else, and that constitute what you call the main approach that that should be on the basis focus for the humanitarian action. But how do they perceive dignity, for example? Is this something are they ever included in policy discussions?
We didn't exactly ask that question directly, but I guess indirectly, the way they defined it was supposed to be identified as a regular person instead of an IDP, because constantly what they were saying is that although we're ethnically Oromo, like the land is open to everyone, and we just want to live a simple life and not be labelized as IDPs. It's been almost 2 years since they settled in Adama, but they're still very segregated, very isolated from the community, and still they're identified as IDPs. So nobody's. Like the initial response was very good. Of course, people were cooking food for them. In different kabales, people were giving out different donations, cash donations, material support. But after a while, it changed to, like you're here to stay, but we're just hoping to help you for some time. But then it didn't happen that way. So in a way, the first response was like, they were still honored and dignified, I guess, but then it sort of changed to they felt like they didn't belong there, and they just wanted to live a simple life and just be normal, I guess, and not be considered as an IDP.
Well, I mean, this is what this is very interesting in a sense, well, when first Rohingya people were coming to Rohingya camps, right? They were received as if guests. So people from different parts of the country, and what you call collected gifts and collected basic ingredients, and they were taking pictures, these photo taking opportunities and publicities and Facebookings, but after a few months, it just it just went off, and people started to talk these people are nonsense, they're burden, they're having huge what you call costing us financially, ecologically, environmentally. They're ruining the local economy because because they are influx, because they have outnumbered the whole community, and they're taking job opportunities, and it becomes. And that's why I was so keen when you said a whole of the society approach. A whole of society includes the host community. It's not the politicians, it's not the the humanitarian actors, it's also the host communities whose perception needs to be taken into consideration when you try to think of long-term solutions and all these things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess with for at least for the Adama case, the IDPs were small in number, about 1,300 registered IDPs. Of course, there were unregistered IDPs who did not receive housing and stuff, but the actual registered IDPs were just 1,300. But even then, there was a huge cultural gap. And when you said the way they define dignity, you identified safety, identity, religious freedom, education, knowledge, but even with those sort of things, I think they were still looking beyond that and just being accepted for who they are and just live a simple life. And that was very interesting, because in terms of safety, at least the IDPs in Adama are somewhat safe because they have their own housing. Identity, of course, they're labeled as IDPs, but they get a local ID where they can get different public services such as free healthcare, free education, religious freedom. They were able, actually, the host community actually pitched in, and they were able to construct a mosque for them within the settlement area. So all these positive things were done, but they still felt to some extent unwanted, unaccepted, and labeled as IDPs. So
And unwelcome.
absolutely, yep.
Yeah.
No more They were first welcomed, of course, but then it felt like, oh, they were just staying there
The
for
philanthropy level goes down a bit, right?
absolutely, yep.
Can you see like in a question here that is Ru Yu Lin? Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong again, but I hope I have managed to pronounce it right. She asks like, that if you could talk a bit more about the relation between religion or faith and dignity, and how they are like articulated and mutually enhancing. Would you like to give it a go, or you want me to go first?
You go ahead, I think.
Sure. Ru, thank you very much for asking this question. It's like, for the people we have, in our case, religion was one of the key things for their dignity. They survive, they even die for their faith. It's like, if they have, for example, to give you one perception, when we were asking the Rohingya people in Bangladeshi camps, like, what do you want to do? Do you want to go back to Bangladesh? Do you want to go back to Myanmar, or you are better off here? So the response was like, look, I am better off in Bangladeshi camps, even though these camps are really cramped, congested, we don't have enough of this. We have like same meal over and over again from the humanitarian actors, like we cannot work, we are like we cannot go outside, we cannot work, and all these things. And I was like, you still want to stay here? And he was like, no, look, if I stay in this place, and what will happen, I will get, if I die here, I will have a dignified burial that is allowed in my religion. So that they were talking about a burial, which is a religious burial, right? So they will have a dignified end of their life. They were comparing this when they were being shot at, and their dead bodies were burnt alive, or their dead bodies were thrown into the river. They could not the people who survived, who could not show their respect to the people who have died, let alone the level of violence, the level of violence, story of violence we have heard, and especially in terms of when they saw people went to the mosque just for praying. These were quite shocking to them. It's like that when other people can go to school, when other people go and pray for their gods, why will not be able to do that? And just because of willing to do that, to intend to do that, being shot at and being raped and being persecuted is just a serious problem for them. So I think some of them understand that upholding each other's dignity, respect is very important, but they also feel like it is within their right to perform what others are allowed to do. And like the example I was giving, that it is important for them to protect their dignity, which is culturally sensitive for men and women, separate, not being raped, not being touched through when they collect for humanitarian support and all these things. And even in some cases, they want to stay in a separate country just because they can have a dignified religious burial. This might help. You want to add anything, Delina?
Yes, in the case of Adama, it's different, but in a way it's also similar. Because initially, again, like I said, people were very welcoming to the point where IDPs who came from the Somali region, where most of them are, I can say almost all of them are Muslims. So they built mosques in their resettlement area, and everything was okay until there was a huge disagreement between the previous owners of the land, which were farmers, and most of them were Christians. And that led to a huge conflict, to the point where I believe people have died, and a mosque was burned. And also the church that was near to the resettlement area was endangered to some extent. And so I guess the way they would define dignity, the way they would relate dignity is, of course, they were able to freely exercise. Everybody is free to exercise in whatever religion they want, but it all came down to that piece of land which was initially owned, land in Ethiopia is owned by the government, but you can lease it for 99 years. And so that land was used or utilized by Christians prior to the IDPs settling. So that created a huge conflict. But they were able to settle it in a way, but I guess still religion and that conflict created a huge chaos, and that also pushed the host community to sort of say, oh, they're creating this conflict. They're not like peacefully living in this area. So it escalated to other conflicts as well.
Thank you, Delina. What we'll do, we have our final presenter to make it fair for everyone. We'll bring Monica in. And Barbara, I can see your question, but please, if you could hold on to your question, let's just finish with Monica's presentation, and we will get back to your question to begin with our end of this question and answer session. Is that all right? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. So let's bring Monica on, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Monica Addison, a research fellow at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, Kumasi, Ghana. And I am presenting a paper on behalf of my two other co-authors, Ebenezer Usuado and Albert Ahin. And we are presenting a paper entitled Ensuring Dignified Resolution for Refugees in Ghana, the Role of Academia. Somebody may ask, why are we even going into this research? We believe that as an academia, we have a role to play in our communities. As part of our social responsibility, we are supposed to also think about refugees, but it appears like refugee issues has been on a low tone among the academia. And therefore, we decided to go into this study to understand the role of higher education institutions in advancing the public discussion about forced migration, and thereby ensuring a dignified life for those affected in Ghana. Next slide, please. This is the outline of my presentation. I will briefly take you through the introduction of our paper, the methodology, the methods that we use to collect data and analyze it, our findings, key findings that came out of the study, and then we'll draw conclusions and recommendations. Next slide, please. Introduction. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development pledges to leave no one behind, as it enjoins countries to improve the lives of their citizens. Improvement of life of citizens include education. However, millions of people are forcibly displaced every year globally, according to UNHCR 2019. Out of this number, 86% of them find themselves in exile in low-income countries adjacent to. Higher education institutions have not given much attention to this call. Given the centrality of teaching and learning to a higher educational institutions, all-inclusive education becomes a top human rights issue. The right to education appears to be a direct and unquestionable implication of human dignity. According to Swaziza 2016, he's saying that once we are able to give a person education, then it has a direct bearing on the person's human dignity. Next slide, please. What do we mean by human dignity in refugees? Human dignity has two related dimensions: the intrinsic and equal value of each human being, and a dignified human life, that is a life lived under decent conditions, according to Cost 2014. For the purpose of this study, a dignified resolution means increasing refugee access to dignified and safe life and creating a safe haven for all. Next slide, please. So our aim of this research is to understand the role of higher education institutions in ensuring a dignified life for refugees in Ghana. Next slide, please. And these are our research questions. What are the barriers to refugees' access to a higher education in Ghana? And what can the higher education institutions do to ensure a dignified life for refugees? Next slide, please. After qualitative, descriptive, exploratory design, as I indicated earlier on, because refugee issues seem not to be much, higher education seem not to know much about refugee issues. So we adopted qualitative, descriptive, exploratory design. And the method, we collected data through three main levels. That is secondary data through to study about other countries, what they have done, to be able to contextualize the study. And then we also collected primary data, one-on-one interview using checklists. And finally, we also collated some qualitative data through field observations. Next slide, please. Understand the role of higher education. We adopted maximum variation purposive sampling of 6 key informants from the staff of Ghana Refugee Board and implement some selected implementing partners. There are 4 main refugee camps in Ghana. We selected 2 of them, 2 of the camps, and interviewed 22 of the refugees. And finally, we have, as a higher education institution in Ghana, we also, like K University is also a higher education institution in Ghana, so we spoke to about 25 faculty members to find out their view about what we can do to help the refugees. And the data was analyzed using thematic analysis, and also it was analyzed manually. Next slide, please. The first theme that emerged out of the study is the challenges of refugees' access to higher education institutions. What are their challenges? One, we found out that one of the main challenges of their entry to higher education is not meeting entry requirements of entry requirements, and also difficulty in financing education. You know, now currently about 60 to 70% of our student population pay fees and not also eligible for available scholarships. And finally, language barrier. You know, there are some people that do not come from English-speaking countries, and therefore when they come here, it is very difficult for them to be absorbed into the formal education in Ghana. Next slide, please. The second theme was we wanted to find out their perception about our role as higher education institutions. How do they perceive us to be able to help them to be able to achieve a dignified life? And these are the responses that they think that if we are able to facilitate their access to scholarship or provide scholarship for them, and they are able to get a higher education, they will be okay. Eventually, they will be able to the higher education, the academia, the scholars play. And they spoke about psychological support services, which includes counseling and also trauma mitigation support. They also spoke about research advocacy. And then under the research, they spoke about trying to know what the country can gain out of the expertise, and also publishing such findings to bring their issues into the domain of the public. And also we also proposed that we can also do conferences and also amplify their challenges so that the public will become aware of their plight. And then we also said that solidarity, you should be able to show solidarity to them in terms of, they have special occasions like Refugee Days. We think that during that time, if we represent ourselves in numbers, then they will know that we are behind them, we are with them. They give them, then they'll be happy about it. And also, we also said that because most of them may not want to go back to their country of origin, it is good that we should also start working towards integration integrating them into their societies. And we see it as one of our social responsibilities we can do in terms of sensitizing the communities. Normally, the communities are very suspicious of them. They think that they are a threat to them and they don't want to accept them. But as higher education, we can engage them in serious discussion, letting them know that they are not a threat and sensitizing the community to accept them as one of us. And also training them to be able to know our culture, how they can be able to cope in the culture or the environment that they find themselves. Next slide, please. In conclusion, what we found is that we realized that their perception about us is different from what we perceive that they need from us to be able to get dignified life. So we think that this finding is telling us that we do not really know their issues very well as a higher education institution. And this is not new finding. This finding was also found a similar study by Dryden Peterson 2011 and Tabot 2013 all observed that higher education have not given much attention to the refugee issues as part of their social responsibilities. And in this age of globalization and higher education internationalization, higher education institutions need, that is our conclusion, need to understand the procedures and challenges involved in reintegrating refugees into higher education. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, this is our recommendation that higher education institutions should prioritize research, advocacy, and support services to refugee issues as part of their social responsibility and community engagement strategy. And the government, the donor community, and other stakeholders should also allocate funding. You know, research goes with funding so that they can support higher education institutions or universities to go into deeper, research into to be able to find out their issues and then be able to produce policy relevant evidence with relevant stakeholders to address the human development challenge in Ghana. Next slide, please. And these are the references. Next slide. Last slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So what I'll do, I'll take off the slides and open the podium if there is any question for you at this minute. If not, for the next 15 minutes, we will have general discussion about the whole panel. And we already have a question down there. We can start with that later, but let's just give everybody the opportunity like we have had for ourselves. I'll open the podium if anybody want to ask any question is specific to your presentation. Okay, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Any question from Monica? Barbara, I can see your question. We'll come back to this just to give a fair opportunity for each presenter that we have given for everybody. If anybody has any specific question for Monica, would like to take it first. So this is us, the people who have presented for this whole panel. And we can have some general discussion. Right. Looks like Delina has left. So it's us. And I will leave the podium open. But let's start with the question we have, which is from Barbara. Did we inquire if the IDP's place attachment to the original place had a bearing to how they perceive their dignity, and what was done about it to ensure that they embrace the new place? Barbara, what an interesting question it is. We have definitely asked in our study how IDP's place of attachment to their original place have influenced their dignity. It is of course related, because in Rohingya's case, they were consistently comparing how their previous generations enjoyed much more freedom, and when things were curtailed, when they were given a new ID card that only accepts them as a particular foreign group rather than a national of the Myanmar. This was also the case for Afghan IDPs. When they used to live in a separate place, they used to tell like how life was easy, how everything was so honorable and respectable, and they could access to their basic rights. Basic rights as in they had a house and something to eat, and they did not have to think of their safety and security because they were safe and secure in that location. So contrastedly, in a contrasted way, in Myanmar, the Rohingyas were less secured, but in Afghanistan, the IDPs were more secured, right? So for Afghan IDPs, security and going back to original place is when the war ends and when there is some mechanism for support for them to go back, they feel that is a more preferred option rather than staying in a congested, urbanized, very crowded urban settings. But for Myanmar Rohingyas, they only want to go back if they're given a full citizenship right. And you see the negotiation of repatriation has been stopped there because the government of Bangladesh is saying it is not our responsibility or it is not within our remit to negotiate with the Myanmar government that they need to be given a citizenship right. You have came here, we have given you refuge and shelter for humanitarian reasons. We can make you safely, safe departure, but it has to be that country will have to ensure some safety. And once we know that safety is ensured and you will not be violated your rights again, we could do that bit probably, but we cannot guarantee that there will be citizenship which is not within our control or grasp. So in response to that, the Rohingyas were trying to come up with some solutions that how about something under the supervision of the United Nations, a third-party guarantee, right? So if there is a third-party warranty, they will feel much safer that there will be a monitoring body there. In Afghanistan, the situation is slightly different because it's the problem is more political, and the political insurgency in terms of violent conflict and war ongoing is not something that has started only last 2, 3, 4 years or last decade. It has been ongoing for a historical time. It will take multiple factors into consideration when they will be able to go back, and that involves the geopolitics of the country, internal politics, and the international support they receive, and also internal politics of various factional groups. You call them religious groups or insurgent violent groups. It is up to you. So there are multiple and complex issues involved, but of course, to sum up, IDPs related their notion of dignity compared to their place of origin, and we try to explore this as much as possible. I hope this answers your question. It looks like we have had few questions answered. If you have any question for us, you have our email addresses, and please do get in touch with us. Like I was talking about our research, this is an ongoing research funded by the British Academy. We will be publishing and we can let you all know. And if you want to be in touch with us about our particular research, please email me. I'll try to respond and provide you the materials you might need. Similarly, if you have any question for Adama, the whole of society approach presentation, when Delina presented and explained to your questions, please get back to Delina. And if you have any question for Monica, please email Monica or all of us together. We'll try to explain and respond to your question as best as we can. If there is no further question, or if there is no further comment or suggestion, can I just say thank you so very much for joining this morning and helping us to smoothly running this panel. Thank you so much. Take care. Goodbye. Here is Margaret. Margaret?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your help. I just wanted to introduce and acknowledge your help to convene this panel. Thank you very much.
That's nice. Bye.
Take care. Bye, everyone.